He humiliated her in front of the entire department. A smirk on his face, laughter echoing behind her as she stood frozen, the report he'd twisted against her still clenched in her hand. It wasn't just the mistake he blamed on her, it was the way he did it, publicly, cruelly, like she didn't matter. But as the heat rose to her cheeks and the silence thickened in the room, she did not cry. She did not plead. She met David's eyes across the table, nodded once, and sat down. Quietly, that was the moment. Not of defeat, but decision. He thought he'd broken her. He never imagined she'd begin designing his collapse right then, with the calm precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. The next morning, she walked into the office as if nothing had happened. Same smile, same coffee in hand, same calm greetings, but something had changed behind her eyes. She laughed at his jokes when others were around. She offered to take on his overflow work with polite enthusiasm. She played her part well to well. Every word, every step she took inside that office now had purpose. Behind that steady gaze was a quiet storm gathering strength. She memorized patterns, schedules, passwords glimpsed in reflection, offhand comments he made to others thinking she wasn't listening. To David, she remained the helpful subordinate he could mock without consequence. But underneath, she was already tightening threads he hadn't noticed unraveling. David wasn't just arrogant, he was sloppy in his certainty. She began to see it everywhere. The way he pitted teammates against each other just to watch the tension play out. The way he always seemed to know about changes in upper management before they were announced. The sudden disappearances of people who challenged him, always followed by vague HR emails. He was playing a game, pulling strings behind the scenes. But now, someone else was watching. She saw the way he leaned in too close to certain junior hires, the favoritism disguised as mentorship, the deals he made over drinks that never left. A paper trail. All these things he thought were invisible. They weren't. Not to her. Late nights became her allies. She stayed behind after everyone left, memorizing his habits, accessing shared drives when no one was watching. She learned who he emailed and what he deleted, the server logs he never thought someone like her would check. And in between, she listened to whispers in break rooms, venting in bathrooms, even murmured warnings from those who had once dared to stand against him and lost. It all began forming a picture. His carefully maintained empire was flawed, riddled with cracks he'd never bothered to seal. Because why would he? In his mind, no one like her could ever be a threat. And then, she found it. The one thing even he couldn't talk his way out of. Buried in an old folder mislabeled and forgotten, she uncovered a report one he had altered to cover up a major budget discrepancy. A mistake that, if traced, could not only cost him his job but spark a formal investigation into every project he'd touched. It was subtle, but it was real. And now it was hers. With that leverage in hand, she didn't rush. She studied it, cross-referenced it, made sure every number, every timestamp could be verified. She knew that this alone wasn't enough. It had to be used at the right time and in the right way. And so, the final act began to take shape. She smiled at him the next morning, warm, harmless. She brought him coffee, told him she'd fix the client deck he'd ruined last minute. And while she did, she replaced one version of a file with another, shifted one internal meeting to overlap with another so when executives asked why he missed it, it would appear careless. She let a junior analyst overhear a snippet of a confidential client complaint, just enough to raise eyebrows. None of it pointed to her, but slowly, quietly, the ground beneath him began to shift. He noticed the change first as a feeling, a creeping discomfort. People weren't responding the same way. Some stopped laughing at his jokes. Some no longer jumped to agree with him. Then came the mistakes. Files misplaced. Reports duplicated. An executive questioning a metric he'd once bluffed through. He grew agitated, called more meetings, blamed more people. But the more he tried to control it, the more things slipped through his fingers. And she was always there, silent, helpful, unassuming, watching, the presentation was the final blow. He walked in ready to charm the board with inflated numbers and doctored projections, something he'd done before without consequence. But this time, someone else had gotten there first. The real data was already on their desks, complete with citations and internal emails backing it up. They didn't shout, they didn't accuse, but David's voice faltered, his palms sweat, his eyes searched the room for help and found none. Silence settled like fog as the reality sank in. His mask had cracked, and behind it was nothing but desperation. Security didn't drag him out. That wasn't her style. Instead, an HR escort waited quietly by the elevator as he was asked to hand over his badge. The office watched in stunned silence as he left, no longer smirking, no longer a king. And as the doors closed behind him, she simply turned back to her desk and resumed typing, calm, steady, unaffected. The same smile on her face from that day he humiliated her, only this time it was earned. There was no celebration, no speech, just a quiet shift in the air. People began coming to her for advice. She didn't rise with noise, but with grace, taking on more, rebuilding the team, rewriting the culture he had poisoned. Promotions came, but that wasn't the point. Power wasn't about titles, it was about respect. And now, finally, she had it, earned through silence, strategy, and resilience. They once dismissed her in a single sentence, overlooked her in every meeting, reduced her to a name on a file. But now, her presence lingered in every corner of that office. And the man who tried to break her, his name was never spoken again. Not because they forgot, but because she made sure his legacy ended the moment he underestimated her. He said she was replaceable, not in a whisper, not behind closed doors. He said it in front of the entire executive team during Q for review, with a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth and a condescending chuckle that echoed longer than any of his words. Zara's good, David had said, casually flipping through the pitch deck she'd worked on for 3 months, but talent like that, replaceable. No one laughed, no one defended her either. Silence thickened like a fog, and she stood there, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. Her pulse was loud in her ears, but her face gave nothing away. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity. In that moment, she made a decision. He thought he had humiliated her. What he didn't know was he had just hired the architect of his own downfall. She didn't miss a single day of work. She showed up early, stayed late, and offered polite smiles to those who avoided her gaze. If there was a crack in her voice, no one heard it. If there was fire behind her eyes, it was masked with cool professionalism. David continued his theatrics, pleased with the silence he had bought with humiliation. But Zara had already begun to notice the details, the emails that never CC'd her, the ideas that disappeared after casual conversations and reappeared in someone else's presentation under David's name. She said nothing. Not yet. He thrived on confrontation. He wouldn't get the satisfaction. Instead, she waited and watched. It was in the waiting that she started seeing the gaps, places where David's charm began to fray. The overconfidence in meetings, the financials that didn't quite line up with the project budgets she'd worked on firsthand, the promotions bypassing more capable employees in favor of his weekend golf buddies. It had all been scattered noise before. Now, it aligned into a symphony of deceit. She remembered the time he called her late at night, frantic about a budget review. She'd walked him through it, only to find the revised numbers later published under his name. The ghosting after her successful project completion, the sudden removal of her leadership title with no explanation. Every red flag she once rationalized now burned bright. The pattern wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And David was at the center of it. Zara began documenting everything, quietly, methodically. A folder on her home drive filled with time-stamped emails, backups of altered spreadsheets, and scanned copies of reports David had asked her to revise, always without a paper trail. Every time he leaned on her, she leaned back just enough to let him feel secure. Let him think she was still useful, still docile, Still, in his words, replaceable, she never confronted him. Instead, she built her case with the patience of a surgeon. Every conversation logged, every discrepancy noted. She noticed how he avoided sending emails when he could delegate blame through phone calls or whispered directives. But she recorded it all. The digital fingerprints he thought he was clever enough to erase were already in her archive. And then, finally, he slipped. David asked her to prep a revised quarterly report for the board, one that had a major loss. Under the guise of a strategic investment, he didn't say falsify, of course. He said frame it better. But he made the mistake of sending her the draft he wanted doctored with his edits tracked and his name embedded in the metadata. She didn't confront him. She thanked him, quietly exported it to PDF, and stored the original in her now weaponized evidence bank. From that moment on, it was no longer defense. It was offense. She began grooming a junior analyst, bright, ethical, and hungry. She gave her small leadership opportunities, let her shine in team meetings. David, distracted by his own maneuvers, didn't notice how the power balance was shifting beneath him. Zara pushed him toward bad decisions subtly, a risky client deal here, a misrepresented report. They're always making sure his fingerprints were the ones on the page, not hers. When the moment arrived, it didn't come with fireworks. It began with a single question at the quarterly board meeting. David, can you walk us through the valuation figures on page 6? He faltered, stuttered, then fumbled through a half-truth that only made the next question sharper. Zara remained silent until the last file was pulled up. The one with David's original tracked edits, his digital signature, his instructions. No shouting followed, just silence, cold, stunned silence. Executives stared, HR scribbled, legal whispered. David's face drained of color as the narrative collapsed, and all his careful puppeteering unraveled in front of the people he had once controlled. His voice cracked as he tried to explain. He pointed fingers, blamed oversights, but no one defended him. And when his eyes finally met Zara's across the boardroom, she didn't look away, she didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply sat back in her chair, calm and composed. As David was asked to step out. By the end of the day, his name was scrubbed from the internal database. His office emptied. The firm's leadership realigned, but Zara never mentioned his name again. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any speech he had ever given. The team looked to her now, not just as a peer but as the one who had endured, rebuilt, and led with quiet brilliance. The promotions came. The respect followed. The very floor she once walked with her head down now felt like her own. David had called her replaceable, but in the end, she replaced him with someone smarter, more ethical, and unforgettable. And when people asked how it happened, no one could quite say. All they knew was he underestimated the wrong woman and she let him. Late nights became her sanctuary, a place where silence wrapped around her like a cloak and the hum of the city outside faded into nothing. Alone at her desk, Zara sifted through files, cross-checking figures, tracing patterns, and collecting fragments of truth that David thought were hidden behind layers of corporate smoke and mirrors. Each piece of evidence she gathered was a thread, and slowly, she began weaving them into a tight, unbreakable web. This wasn't a reckless act born from pain or anger. It was a calculated strategy, a quiet blueprint for justice. The man who had broken her, who had undermined her at every turn, was about to discover that his empire was not as solid as he believed. Trust was a rare commodity in this office, but it flickered in an unexpected corner. A junior accountant, earnest and eager yet unaware of the full stakes, accidentally handed Zara access to sensitive financial data that no one else had seen. This unintentional gift was a turning point. With this newfound insight, she could connect the dots more clearly. Discrepancies in budgets, hidden transactions, and questionable reallocations that spoke louder than any boardroom accusation. More importantly, the subtle shift in alliances hinted that others too had grown wary of David's tightening grip. The atmosphere was changing. loyalties beginning to realign beneath the surface. While Zara prepared her next moves with quiet confidence, memories played on the edges of her mind, sharp and vivid like shards of glass. The humiliation during the last company meeting, the public dismissal, the condescending tone in David's voice each moment fueled her determination. She recalled the nights spent doubting herself, the subtle dismissals that chipped away at her until only resolve remained. But those memories were no longer wounds, they were weapons. Every slight, every betrayal had been meticulously catalogued, forming the foundation of a plan that was as precise as it was ruthless. She was no longer reacting, she was orchestrating, letting the past sharpen her focus rather than cloud it. Patiently, she began to manipulate the very system that had been used against her. With steady hands, she adjusted budget credits, redirecting funds to projects she supported, ensuring that David's favored initiatives stumbled without drawing suspicion. Emails were rerouted, meeting notes subtly altered, and narratives quietly rewritten to expose inconsistencies only she could reveal. No sudden moves, no overt challenges, just a series of careful adjustments that gradually undermined David's control. The office had always been a stage, and now Zara was moving the pieces with a skillful hand, unseen but undeniable. David, meanwhile, remained wrapped in his own confidence. His boasts during meetings, the assured smirks when discussing upcoming deals, all betrayed a blindness to the storm brewing beneath him. He spoke of victories yet to come, of loyalty unquestioned, unaware that those around him were quietly questioning, whispering doubts that would soon grow into undeniable truths. His arrogance was the trap itself, and with every careless promise and self-satisfied grin, he sealed his fate further. The foundation beneath him was cracking, but he was too proud to notice. As the tide shifted, Zara's influence blossomed. She began mentoring colleagues who had felt sidelined or overlooked, offering guidance and encouragement that won their respect and loyalty. These subtle alliances grew into a quiet network, each member a small fracture in David's previously unassailable reign. He tried to assert control, but the office no longer moved at his command. Trust was eroding, power shifting, and Zara remained the calm center of it all, poised to guide the coming change. The change was barely noticeable. At first, the way conversations faltered when David entered the room, the slight hesitation before agreeing with his ideas. But beneath the surface, the walls of his empire trembled. Reports he once dismissed now drew scrutiny. Budgets he manipulated were questioned. The atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken tension, as if the building itself awaited the collapse. Zara's patience held steady, knowing that every crack was a step closer to justice, and yet David stayed blind to the transformation. Unseen, unchallenged, Zara positioned herself perfectly, her moves measured and deliberate. While he reveled in imagined control, she prepared the final strike. The calm before the fall was hers to command, a quiet promise that soon, the man who had underestimated her would finally face the consequences of his arrogance. David sat back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips as he reviewed the client numbers he'd just finalized. The figures were slightly altered enough to inflate the quarterly earnings, to please the board and push investors into a frenzy. It was a risky move, but one he was confident would never be uncovered. After all, he'd covered his tracks with careful precision, burying the truth beneath layers of manipulated spreadsheets and diverted communications. To him, the game was already won, but across the office, Zara's eyes flickered over the same data, now with a different lens. She was no longer blinded by trust or loyalty. Her mind sifted through the numbers for inconsistencies, and what she found was undeniable. She quietly accessed the original reports, cross-referencing every entry with client feedback and billing records. As the discrepancies emerged, so did a plan. She saved copies, encrypted files, and built a silent arsenal of evidence. No noise, no confrontation, just a calm preparation for the moment when truth would speak louder than lies. One afternoon, An anonymous tip landed on the compliance department's desk, a whisper of suspicion regarding the latest financial report. The note was precise, pointing to questionable figures and urging a thorough audit. David remained unaware as his carefully crafted facade began to crack from the inside out. Investigators started probing, numbers were requested, explanations demanded. His confidence wavered, but outwardly he maintained his usual bravado, unaware that the chain reaction had been set in motion by Zara's quiet intervention. Meanwhile, Zara was already moving forward. She submitted a proposal for a new reporting system, one that would increase transparency and reduce the chance of manipulation. Her colleagues admired her initiative, and the management saw the promise in her vision. What David didn't realize was that this proposal was more than a project. It was a calculated maneuver to dismantle his control and highlight her competence. By championing change, she was setting the stage to expose the cracks beneath David's authority. The day of the big presentation arrived, and David was invited to introduce Zara's system as if it were his own idea. Confident and cocky, he stepped to the podium, unaware that the setup was designed to expose him. Midway through his demonstration, the system seemed to falter, screens flickered, data appeared scrambled. A collective murmur spread through the room. Then Zara took the microphone, calmly stepping forward to restore order. Her expertise shone as she corrected the issues live, transforming chaos into control. The applause was immediate, and David's forced smile barely masked his growing unease. From that moment on, Zara's reputation soared while David's began to crumble. Questions surfaced about the system's sudden failure and the inconsistencies in his explanations. The HR department, joined by compliance officers, intensified their inquiries. Minor missteps turned into glaring oversights. Little lies piled up into undeniable truths. As investigations deepened, David's grip on power loosened, and his once impenetrable fortress showed signs of collapse. Panic took hold of David as the walls closed in, his confident mask slipping away piece by piece. Meanwhile, Zara stood firm, her final words ringing clear and cold. "He thought I was replacing numbers. I was replacing him." The office held its breath as David's empire began to fall, and Zara stepped into the light, unshaken, victorious, and undeniably in control. The room fell silent as Zara stepped up to the podium at the leadership summit. With calm authority, she laid out the audit report, meticulously detailed, undeniable, and devastating. Numbers once manipulated to build a facade of success now unraveled like a thread, pulling apart the entire tapestry of David's empire. Whispers spread quickly as executives absorbed the truth. The fraudulent trail was no longer hidden. The man who once commanded respect was exposed, his credibility shattered in a single moment. Zara's voice never wavered, but beneath the surface, a fierce resolve simmered. This was only the beginning. Chaos rippled through the department, panic threatening to spiral out of control. Yet Zara moved with steady hands, quickly organizing teams, addressing concerns, and restoring a sense of order where disorder reigned. Her calm presence became the anchor amidst the storm, reassuring those around her that the company could survive, even without its fallen leader. While tensions exploded beneath polite facades, she remained focused, balancing compassion with strategy, knowing that every move mattered now more than ever. Then came the unexpected blow. Internal recordings leaked to the executive board, catching David's voice in sharp clarity. Threats, manipulations, and veiled intimidation spilled out across the room, exposing his true nature to all who once blindly followed. The polished veneer cracked further as colleagues exchanged stunned glances, realizing the extent of his deceit. Each word in those recordings reinforced the weight of his betrayals, turning former doubts into undeniable truths. No one could ignore what they had heard, and the tide began to shift decisively. Quietly, loyalties began to realign. Allies of convenience disappeared, retreating into shadows as Zara's network grew stronger and more resolute. In whispered conversations and exchanged nods, Trust shifted away from the man who had ruled through fear. David found himself increasingly isolated, the walls closing in with every passing hour. No voice rose in his defense. No hand reached out in solidarity. The silence around him was not just absence, it was condemnation. Desperation crept in as David grasped for any lifeline. He attempted to deflect blame onto subordinates, painting himself as a scapegoat caught in a larger scheme. But his words fell flat in the vacuum of silence. The boardroom no longer tolerated excuses or evasion. The evidence stood firm, and the quiet judgment of colleagues spoke louder than any protest. There was no escape from the consequences his own choices had wrought. Security arrived with clinical precision, deactivating his access badge and escorting him from the building. The man who once commanded power walked a path of defeat, stripped of his empire and dignity. Eyes followed his every step, some filled with disbelief, others with relief. It was a walk that marked an end not just to a career, but to a reign built on lies and manipulation. As the doors closed behind him, the future opened wide for someone else. In the hallway, their paths crossed briefly. David's gaze flickered, with a mix of resentment and disbelief, but Zara met it with a quiet, unwavering smile. It was not a smile of triumph, nor of cruelty. It was the calm assurance of one who had waited patiently and struck with precision. In that single moment, the power dynamic was undeniable, a silent testament to her victory without the need for words or confrontation. His final thought echoed the truth he could no longer deny. Once he had dismissed others as replaceable, but now he himself was forgotten, erased from the narrative he tried so hard to control. Meanwhile, Zara stepped forward into the light, her place unchallenged and her strength undeniable. She was no longer the overlooked shadow. She was the future, steady and unyielding. David's name, once spoken with a mix of fear and grudging respect, now fell on deaf ears. His reputation lay shattered, crumbling like brittle glass underfoot. Former allies turned their backs, professional contacts dissolved into silence, and every door he once confidently opened slammed shut with harsh finality. The world he had dominated with calculated cruelty no longer recognized him. Rejection followed him relentlessly, a constant shadow stripping away the power he once wielded effortlessly. As he roamed the fringes of his old network, he felt the cold truth settle. He was no longer untouchable, humbled and unemployed. David found himself grasping at the remnants of his former life. His attempts to reclaim the position he once held with iron fists were met with nothing but cold refusals. Invitations evaporated before arrival. Messages remained unanswered. The pride that had fueled his ruthless climb now became a barrier, repelling those who remembered his tyranny too well. Each rejection was a silent sentence, reinforcing his fall. In this quiet storm of denial, David's arrogance offered no shelter, only isolation. His legacy, once carefully curated through manipulations and polished lies, began to dissolve. His LinkedIn profile, the digital monument to his supposed success, was scrubbed clean, years of fabricated accomplishments erased without a trace. Industry peers distanced themselves, erasing his influence from the narrative. The carefully built illusion of his indispensability crumbled, replaced by whispers of disgrace. Forgotten by the very community that once sought his favor, David became a ghost in a world that refused to remember. Meanwhile, Zara stepped forward with steady resolve. Within weeks, she moved seamlessly into the role David had vacated, not as a temporary placeholder, but as the undeniable new leader. Her presence was a quiet force, reshaping expectations and rewriting the culture left fractured by his reign. Unlike the fear he instilled, she commanded respect through fairness and strength. Where he had ruled with selfish arrogance, she cultivated loyalty and shared purpose. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Zara's ascendance was the turning of a page. David's fatal mistake lay in underestimating what leadership truly meant. While he clung to outdated methods of dominance, Zara redefined power as resilience and integrity. Under pressure, She built a culture where voices were heard, not silenced. Her influence grew quietly, yet unrelentingly, replacing harshness with hope and strategy. The workplace transformed, and with it, the grip of the past tyrant loosened irrevocably. Her calm, measured words now opened meetings that once echoed with his cruel tirades. Each sentence was deliberate, thoughtful, an invitation to collaboration, rather than command. Where David's presence had cast long shadows, Zara's leadership brought clarity and light. She guided discussions with a steady hand, drawing out the best in those around her. Her new voice commanded the room with undeniable authority, a testament to earned respect rather than seized control. Her steady rise was a triumph written in silence and strength. Success was not a stolen throne, but a fortress built with patience and fairness. The past tyrant's reign was over, replaced by a leader who proved true power comes from lifting others, not breaking them. The victory was complete without bitterness, or boast only the quiet knowledge that justice had been served. He said I was replaceable, Zara would later reflect, the words carrying a quiet power. So I replaced him with someone better. In that truth lay the final note of reckoning, a reminder that those who dismiss others often fail to see their own end. David's fall was absolute, and Zara's rise unchallenged, marking a new era where respect and strength walked hand in hand.